Here is Colorverse Methuselah Tree, a red ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Now, don't let my lack of skill with a zoom nib fool you about this slightly magenta-leaning red ink. Though I really expected a red-leaning brown after seeing the chromatography, with that, this shades more as if it were a brown than if it were a red. But I put it as a red because it really did look more red to me in the writing. There's only a little bit of tone variation as the nib and paper changes, making this a fairly consistent tone and performance. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it does drop slightly in performance, but not enough to really prevent its usage. Now, not so much in the zoom, but I enjoyed this ink very much more in other pens, and it makes for a red that has some real interest and character on the page, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Again, just not from this zoom nib. The pen for today is a Sailor 1911 large with a zoom nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. So here we can see why I was calling it a red, and in certain areas you can see why I would have considered it towards a brown. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, which is not a surprise when dealing with Clairfontaine. It does shade fairly well from light to dark. Take a look at dark on the third line, where it starts lighter with the D, it goes to a nice mid-tone with the A, lightens up again with the R, much darker in the K. And it's the much darker letters that really get me thinking about this as it might have been intended to be a brown, but I'm not sure because I didn't look up the tree. I'm not trying to be an expert in all things around ink. I'm just trying to be someone very experienced using ink. I think this looks very nice on the page. The amount of shading that we're getting is really very surprising in a very pleasant way. Looking at the back of the page, there's really no bleeding and no ghosting. Now, we do see some of it happening here on the edges, but I think that has more to do with paper aging than this ink, so I'm not going to count that against it. I'm going to say no bleed, no ghost, and happy situations. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Colorverse Crystal Planet. Here is Colorverse Einstein Ring. Here is Colorverse Hubble Zoom. Here is Colorverse Lights on Series. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Here, our tone is just a slight bit lighter in general, but the tone of red that we're getting here was very present quite a bit on the Clairfontaine. So it's not entirely different. It's just that it's showing more of those lighter tones without feathering and without spread. And yes, it is still shading in the right way. Take a look at right on the second line. You see that it starts fairly light with the RI and works its way darker all the way through to the T at the end. And when that T crosses the H, it gets a bit darker. Now, this is a more absorbent paper, which I don't always expect that to happen on this paper, but this paper does tend to do well with fountain pen inks, so I'm not entirely surprised. Looking at the back of the page, you can see just how well it really did with no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Here we have the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, meaning that this is a fairly opaque ink. It's not being affected by the tone of the paper. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it definitely has its areas that it shades. Again, not as well. Take a look at behind on the second line left side. Mostly one tone. The D at the end is quite a bit darker. Goblins also on the second line. The G is slightly darker at the bottom than it is at the top of the G. It holds a nice mid-tone through most of the word. The in at the end does get a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, there's only one spot just above my finger where it did get deeper into the page. But on the majority, I see no real problem with bleeding or ghosting, and I think you could write back here without any kind of a problem. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Here we have a generally lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. More in line with the tone that we had on the Portage. Now again, the tones that we're getting here are not different than we had on the Clairfontaine. We're just getting more of those lighter tones. We do not get feathering and we do not get spread. We do get shading, though I don't think as well as we had on the Clairfontaine, but there's enough that it can be lived with. Take a look at lived on the first line. The dot of the I, very dark. That top of the D, very dark, yet it still happens, like yet right next to that, where the YE is lighter than that T that did get a bit darker. But most important, what we see is that it stands out very nicely against the quad rule. It doesn't get lost in the background, but it doesn't make the quad rule disappear visually. So that's a you thing on, do you want it to disappear as you see it, or do you not mind seeing the quad rule through the ink? Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems back here. Great combination. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Eckermann, their number 18. Here is Blackstone Uluru Red. Here is Diamine Passion Red. Here is Diamine Blood Orange. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Now, this paper generally does lighten up an ink, and it did here. It's quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. Yes, it is shading. You can see it when you look at words like attacked, where the K and the D are a bit darker. It's fairly great to see shading on this paper, like great on the third line, where the R is a bit darker than the GE around it, and the T at the end is quite a bit darker. But the tone is very different. It's not a tone here that I would really run for myself, but it's not a bad tone. It just becomes a preference thing. I think it's fair when it comes to being against this quad rule. It's not horrible. I mean, I'd give a student some credit for using this ink here. It's nice. It's just not probably the best for looking good on this paper. I don't think they're the best combination together. Looking at the back of the page, though, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have no problems. So great news for the students. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Montegrappa Blue Black, or dark blue. Here is Diamine Silver Fox. Here is Lamy Blue. Here is Levenger Raven Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. We are definitely not getting some of the best performance of this ink here. It is a bit lighter and flatter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's a ton of feathering and spread, both to be expected. For one, this is copy paper. Two, this is a wet, broader nib, being that zoom. I do not like this at all in what's going on. There's one or two tiny spots where shading is kind of there, but the overall of what we're seeing makes me really not like it. And all of that feather and spread is very noticeable when you look at the back of the page, where most of this really got very deep into the paper all the way through. However, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath, so it does have that going for it. But you can't write back here. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The Sailor Zoom nib really shows off the tone of this ink quite well. Not my writing, though. Off camera, I used this in a dry fine, and it really stood out great. So I then went into a medium flow, medium nib, and it got even better. Always with nice shading, more character itself, or more characteristic itself of a brown than a red. Reds I don't tend to see a ton of shading in, but in this case we are. So while it looks good from every pen, it truly stands out at its best from a medium flow, medium nib. There it has all of its best qualities really standing at attention. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.